Maya stepped into the glass lobby of the Palo Alto headquarters, wearing a dark Armani suit that looked like armor. She had no employee badge and no plastic lanyard around her neck. The security guard moved to block her path, but then he looked into her eyes. He didn't say a single word. He just stepped aside. 14 months ago, she had left this building with her life in a cardboard box. Today, she was finally back, and Maya definitely wasn't here to ask for her old job back. The air in the glass conference room was thick with the smell of expensive espresso and the hum of high-end servers. Julian stood at the front, his posture sharp like a blade, presenting the quarterly growth metrics to 200 employees. Everyone was silent, hanging on to his every word, because Julian didn't just run the company, he ruled it with a stopwatch. Maya sat in the back row, her laptop open, her mind racing between the complex code on her screen and the baby monitor hidden in her lap. Why did the nanny have to cancel on the most important morning of the fiscal year? The meeting was being streamed live to the remote teams, making the audience even larger and the pressure even more suffocating. Julian was midway through a slide about peak efficiency when a sharp, piercing wail cut through the professional atmosphere like a jagged knife. It was Maya's 6-month-old daughter screaming from the makeshift nursery Maya had set up in the tiny break room next door. The sound echoed off the minimalist concrete walls, turning every head in the room toward the back, where Maya sat frozen. Could the floor just open up and swallow her whole before the inevitable storm arrived? Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd, until they landed directly on Maya's pale, panicked face. The silence that followed was far worse than the crying, a heavy, judgmental vacuum that made the heartbeat in her ears sound like a drum. He didn't look annoyed. He looked disgusted, the way a scientist might look at a contaminated sample in a sterile laboratory. Do you really think this is a daycare center or a high-stakes technology firm competing for global market dominance? But here is where it gets interesting, because Julian didn't just ask her to leave the room. He decided to make her an example. He walked slowly toward her, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished floor, while 200 pairs of eyes watched the execution. He leaned over her desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout in the absolute stillness. You are a talented engineer, Maya, but you are also a persistent glitch in the operating system of this company. How many times have we adjusted your schedule only for your personal life to interfere with our collective march toward progress? He turned to the entire room, spreading his arms wide as if he were performing a tragedy on a Broadway stage. For the masses, this is what happens when we prioritize sentimentality over the cold, hard metrics of success that built this very skyscraper. We cannot afford to carry the weight of someone who is only half invested in the vision we are trying to create. Maya didn't defend herself, even though she had worked until 3 a.m. every night for the last 3 weeks. She didn't tell them that she had finished the legacy code migration ahead of schedule while holding a feverish child in her arms. She simply closed her laptop with a soft click and stood up, her spine straighter than anyone expected from a woman being publicly dismantled. Was it pride that kept her tears back? Or was it the realization that she was in the wrong room? Julian waved a dismissive hand toward the door, not even bothering to look at her as he began to walk back to his podium. Pack your things by noon, because we are officially deleting this system error from the payroll before the next sprint begins. A few people looked away in shame, but most just watched, paralyzed by the specific cruelty of a man who equated human existence with a line of code. It was the kind of moment that changes the trajectory of a life forever, though nobody knew it yet. She walked to her cubicle in the corner, the one decorated with a single framed photo of her daughter and a stack of technical manuals. She found a discarded cardboard box near the recycling bin and began to fill it with her few personal belongings, one slow item at a time. The office continued to hum around her, the corporate machine already moving on as if she had never even occupied that space. Why does the world feel so much colder the moment you stop being useful to people who only value your output? She picked up her box, tucked her crying child against her chest, and walked toward the elevator without looking back at the glass-walled conference room. Behind her, she could hear Julian's voice rising again, talking about the future of the company and the need for absolute, unwavering dedication from everyone. He was already laughing at a joke he made about cleaning house, and the sound of 200 people forced to chuckle followed her out. Maya walked out of the Palo Alto headquarters that day, but she left her old self somewhere in that cardboard box. The air in the glass conference room was thick with the smell of expensive espresso and the hum of high-end servers. Julian stood at the front, his posture sharp like a blade, presenting the quarterly growth metrics to 200 employees. Everyone was silent, hanging on to his every word, because Julian didn't just run the company, he ruled it with a stopwatch. Maya sat in the back row, her laptop open, her mind racing between the complex code on her screen and the baby monitor hidden in her lap. Why did the nanny have to cancel on the most important morning of the fiscal year? The meeting was being streamed live to the remote teams, making the audience even larger and the pressure even more suffocating. Julian was midway through a slide about peak efficiency when a sharp, piercing wail cut through the professional atmosphere like a jagged knife. It was Maya's 6-month-old daughter screaming from the makeshift nursery Maya had set up in the tiny break room next door. The sound echoed off the minimalist concrete walls, turning every head in the room toward the back where Maya sat frozen. Could the floor just open up and swallow her whole before the inevitable storm arrived? Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd until they landed directly on Maya's pale, panicked face. The silence that followed was far worse than the crying, a heavy, judgmental vacuum that made the heartbeat in her ears sound like a drum. He didn't look annoyed. He looked disgusted, the way a scientist might look at a contaminated sample in a sterile laboratory. Do you really think this is a daycare center or a high-stakes technology firm competing for global market dominance? But here is where it gets interesting, because Julian didn't just ask her to leave the room. He decided to make her an example. He walked slowly toward her, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished floor, while 200 pairs of eyes watched the execution. He leaned over her desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout in the absolute stillness. You are a talented engineer, Maya, but you are also a persistent glitch in the operating system of this company. How many times have we adjusted your schedule only for your personal life to interfere with our collective march toward progress? He turned to the entire room, spreading his arms wide, as if he were performing a tragedy on a Broadway stage for the masses. This is what happens when we prioritize sentimentality over the cold, hard metrics of success that built this very skyscraper. We cannot afford to carry the weight of someone who is only half invested in the vision we are trying to create. Maya didn't defend herself, even though she had worked until 3 a.m. every night for the last 3 weeks. She didn't tell them that she had finished the legacy code migration ahead of schedule while holding a feverish child in her arms. She simply closed her laptop with a soft click and stood up, her spine straighter than anyone expected from a woman being publicly dismantled. Was it pride that kept her tears back, or was it the realization that she was in the wrong room? Julian waved a dismissive hand toward the door, not even bothering to look at her as he began to walk back to his podium. Pack your things by noon, because we are officially deleting this system error from the payroll before the next sprint begins. A few people looked away in shame, but most just watched, paralyzed by the specific cruelty of a man who equated human existence with a line of code. It was the kind of moment that changes the trajectory of a life forever, though nobody knew it yet. She walked to her cubicle in the corner, the one decorated with a single, framed photo of her daughter and a stack of technical manuals. She found a discarded cardboard box near the recycling bin and began to fill it with her few personal belongings, one slow item at a time. The office continued to hum around her, the corporate machine already moving on as if she had never even occupied that space. Why does the world feel so much colder the moment you stop being useful to people who only value your output? She picked up her box, tucked her crying child against her chest, and walked toward the elevator without looking back at the glass-walled conference room. Behind her, she could hear Julian's voice rising again, talking about the future of the company and the need for absolute unwavering dedication from everyone. He was already laughing at a joke he made about cleaning house, and the sound of 200 people forced to chuckle followed her out. Maya walked out of the Palo Alto headquarters that day, but she left her old self somewhere in that cardboard box. Maya sat on the edge of her bed in a cramped San Jose apartment. The streetlights from the San Carlos intersection flickered through the thin, dusty curtains. In the crib, her daughter Lily breathed with a soft, rhythmic cadence. The room felt smaller tonight, as if the walls were closing in on them. Every shadow seemed to mock the box sitting on the kitchen counter. How could a whole career fit into such a small, flimsy piece of cardboard? She opened her banking app and stared at the glowing blue screen. The number reflected back was exactly $1.200, and not a single penny more. Rent was due in 10 days, and Lily's next pediatrician visit was Friday. Silicon Valley doesn't care about your stories or your sleepless, exhausting nights. It only cares about your ability to pay for the privilege of existing. Could she survive on this for more than a single desperate month? Her mind raced to the specialized heart monitor Lily needed for her condition. The insurance from her job would vanish by the end of the week. Each medical bill in America feels like a sentence handed down by a judge. Without that coverage, a single emergency could wipe out their entire future instantly. Maya felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of her tired neck. Why did being a mother feel like a liability in this modern world? But the real secret is fear can only paralyze you if you let it. Maya looked at her daughter's tiny sleeping hand curled into a fist. She realized that crying was a luxury she simply could no longer afford. Tears wouldn't pay for the medicine or the heat in the winter. She needed a plan that was stronger than Julian's arrogance or his cruelty. If they wanted a machine, she would become the most efficient one. She walked to the kitchen and cleared a space next to the baby bottles. Her old laptop hummed to life, the fan whirring like a small, determined engine. Knowledge was the only thing Julian couldn't take away from her that morning. He could take her salary, her desk, and her professional reputation today, but he couldn't take the brain that had built his most successful features. She opened a blank document and titled it, "The Path Back." She would learn the things that were currently making the world go round. AI, deep learning, and the complex architecture of the future were her targets. She didn't need a fancy office or a corporate title to grow stronger. She just needed a quiet room and the iron will of a mother. Tomorrow she would visit the library and start the difficult long journey. Julian thought he deleted a glitch, but he actually started a revolution. The San Jose Public Library became her daily sanctuary, a quiet island of knowledge surrounded by the chaotic and expensive reality of the Silicon Valley landscape. She arrived every single morning at exactly 9:00 a.m., pushing Lily in a stroller, while carrying a heavy stack of borrowed textbooks on linear algebra and advanced probability theory. She no longer had a high-end office, with a view only a scratched wooden table in the back corner, where the morning sunlight hit the floor. She opened her old laptop and began to dissect the complex structures of neural networks, her tired eyes burning from the glowing screen and the lack of sleep. But wait, there's more to this struggle, because her days didn't simply end when the library closed its heavy doors at the end of every sunset. She spent 4 long evenings every week waitressing at a local diner on Stevens Creek Boulevard, carrying heavy trays of burgers and fries in worn-out sneakers. She memorized Python syntax and complex data structures while refilling coffee mugs for tech workers who spent their time complaining about their generous stock options. Every single tip she earned went directly into a small glass jar labeled Lily's Future, a growing symbol of her silent defiance against the world. She dove deep into the world of big data and machine learning, teaching herself how to build predictive models that could identify hidden patterns in systems. The logic of the code was beautiful because it didn't care about her status as a mother or her dangerously low bank account balance. A computer does not judge you for your painful past. It only cares if your logic is sound and your syntax is perfectly and undeniably correct. She learned to speak the language of the future, spending her midnight hours debugging complex scripts while Lily slept soundly in the crib beside her. The weeks slowly turned into long months, and the seasons in the valley changed from the dry, punishing heat of summer to the crisp mornings. Her notebooks were filled with hundreds of pages of complex diagrams, architectural charts, and the messy scribbled thoughts of a woman reconstructing her entire soul. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of Julian's cruelty and started seeing herself as the architect of her own inevitable and powerful return. Why should she ever settle for a seat at someone else's table when she finally had the tools to build a much larger one? By the end of the 6th month, the lines of code on her screen started to make sense in a way that felt like a revelation. She was no longer just copying examples from a textbook. She was creating original solutions for problems that most people in Julian's office couldn't even name. She built a prototype for a humanitarian AI project, something designed to help low-income families navigate the complex and confusing maze of social services. She realized that her pain was a unique perspective, a data point that most engineers in their ivory towers would never be able to understand. She began applying for remote internships and freelance consulting gigs, using a carefully chosen pseudonym to avoid any lingering gossip from her previous high-profile termination. Each project she completed was a small victory, a single brick in the foundation of the person she was becoming during these quiet months of transformation. She wasn't just learning how to code, she was learning how to lead with a heart that had been broken and then carefully mended. Could anyone have predicted that a cardboard box full of personal items would lead to such an incredible intellectual explosion in this apartment? The 7th week of her self-imposed exile began with a heavy fog that swallowed the morning sun in Palo Alto. Maya sat at her usual scratched wooden table, the scent of old paper acting as her only comfort. Lily was fast asleep in the stroller beside her, a pink blanket draped over the edge to block the flickering lights. Maya's fingers moved across the keyboard with a frantic energy that only a woman with limited funds could understand. She was building an algorithmic bridge to match single parents with local resources. It was her soul in code, a digital map for those navigating the dark woods alone. She had been staring at the same block of logic for hours, her vision blurring as red error messages blinked on her screen. There was a recursive loop. She couldn't break a flaw that made her predictive model fail every time. She leaned back and rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of her inadequacy pressing down on her chest. But wait, there is more to this library corner than she realized. An older man had been sitting at the table across from her for weeks reading the paper. He wore a faded cardigan and glasses that made his eyes look sharp. He had been watching her. Finally, he cleared his throat, a dry sound that shattered the absolute stillness of the dusty reference section. "You're overweighting the historical income data," he said, without even looking up, his voice calm and authoritative. Maya jumped slightly, her heart racing as she looked at the stranger who had diagnosed her failure with one sentence. She didn't know whether to be angry at his intrusion or shocked by his insight. How could an old man in a library know anything about neural networks? She asked him who he was, her voice sharp with the exhaustion of 14 months of pain. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking like the old floorboards of an expensive San Francisco home. His name was Arthur, a retired venture capitalist who had helped build the foundations of the tech world before Julian was born. He pointed at a specific line of her code with a weathered finger that showed no sign of age. "Your logic is technically correct, but your perspective is far too human for the parameters of your software," he whispered. "You are trying to solve a human problem with a cold solution." He wasn't just an old man. He was an angel, finding magic in the mess. Maya felt a jolt of recognition as she realized that Arthur wasn't mocking her. He was actually mentoring her in a library. He began to explain how she could adjust her algorithm to prioritize empathy over efficiency, a concept Julian called a glitch. Now, listen carefully, because this is where everything started to shift for Maya. Arthur didn't pull out a checkbook or offer her easy money to fix her immediate financial problems. He knew that money was a temporary bandage, but a real opportunity was a permanent cure. He looked at Maya's fierce face and saw potential that corporate recruiters always ignored. He told her about a social project he advised, a non-profit incubator designed for technology the market had left behind. "I don't give handouts to people who are capable of building their own kingdoms," he said with a small smile. "I am offering you an unpaid internship at this foundation, a chance to prove that your human-centric logic is the future." It was a brutal offer for a woman who couldn't afford her next month of rent. He was asking her to work for free while her life was on the line, but he was also offering her a seat at the table. Maya looked at Arthur, then at her daughter, and back at the red error messages on her laptop screen. She realized this was the twist in her story she hadn't expected to find in the back of a library. Julian had fired her because he thought her life was a liability, but Arthur was hiring her because he knew it was an asset. She didn't ask about the lack of pay or the long hours. She simply reached out her hand and shook his, her grip firm and final. This was the moment a business angel realized he was looking at a visionary. They spent the next hours reworking her plan, the Air Electric with the spark of genuine collaboration. Arthur pushed her to think bigger, to stop worrying about the past and start defining the future. She learned more in that afternoon than she had in 4 years at her previous job. The library lights eventually dimmed, signaling that their time in the sanctuary was ending. Maya packed her things, but the weight in her box felt lighter. She walked out into the Palo Alto evening with a clear mission and an ally who believed in her reality. The changing seasons in Palo Alto began to shift quite rapidly now. The dry heat gave way to the cool, crisp mornings of November. Maya didn't count the days anymore as she worked so hard. She counted the breakthroughs in her complex code instead of the time. Every sunrise found her at the same scratched library table as before. Her small apartment was filled with sketches and detailed system diagrams now. She was building a digital world that simply didn't exist yet. She focused on the intersection of advanced math and human empathy. Her AI model was designed specifically for the unseen, hard-working people. It wasn't about squeezing profit from every single vulnerable user online. It was about creating a sturdy safety net for single parents everywhere. She called the project the Guardian Protocol in her private notes. The algorithm learned to recognize when a family needed financial help. It offered smart solutions before the crisis actually hit the home. Arthur taught her that true power isn't about total corporate control. It is about the ability to lift other people up high. Julian managed his team through fear and the constant threat of deletion. Maya wanted to lead with a deep sense of human understanding. She spent hours studying organizational psychology and complex human behavior patterns. She realized that a happy engineer is always a productive one. Compassion wasn't a glitch. It was a high-performance engine for growth. But here is where the real secret started to emerge. Spring arrived with the blooming of the bright California poppies outside. Maya was no longer the broken woman in the cardboard box. Her voice had a new, quiet authority that people respected. She began pitching her project to Arthur's high-level foundation partners. They didn't see a single mother with a heavy burden today. They saw a brilliant leader with a unique and powerful vision. 14 months had passed since that brutal and public Palo Alto morning. Maya looked at her daughter, who was finally walking and laughing. They were ready for the next difficult and inevitable stage now. The quiet work in the library was finally and completely finished. It was time for Maya to step back out into the light. She had built a kingdom in her small San Jose apartment. The world was about to see exactly what she had created. The news started appearing on Maya's social media feeds. like a series of slow, predictable cracks in a high-tech dam. She sat in the library, the glow of the screen highlighting a headline about the mass resignation at Julian's firm. The company that once claimed to own the future was now struggling to maintain its own present. It turns out that when you treat your best engineers like replaceable parts, they eventually find a machine that actually values their input. Maya scrolled through the comments from former colleagues who were finally speaking out about the burnout. Why did it take a complete system failure for the world to see the rot behind the glass walls? Julian's management style was a relic of a time that Silicon Valley was desperately trying to outgrow. He believed in a culture of absolute unwavering surveillance and mandatory 80-hour work weeks. He saw flexibility for parents as a weakness and human empathy as a technical debt that needed to be erased. His internal memos, leaked by a disgruntled junior developer, spoke of crushing the competition through sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. But a team that is constantly running on empty will eventually stall out on the most important hills. Here is where it gets interesting, because the market was beginning to punish his arrogance in real time. The top-tier talent was leaving in droves, and they weren't going to the established giants with big signing bonuses. They were joining smaller, more agile startups that treated them like human beings instead of biological data points. Julian was losing the people who held the keys to his most critical intellectual property. Without those minds, his complex systems were becoming bloated, buggy, and impossible to maintain effectively. He tried to double down on his old methods, demanding even more hours from those who remained. Is it any surprise that the turnover rate hit an all-time high, just as the stock price started to plummet? Maya watched this collapse from her quiet table in San Jose with a calm, detached sense of logic. She didn't feel a surge of petty happiness or a desire for a public "I told you so" moment. She felt a deep professional sadness for the brilliant code that was being ruined by such a short-sighted leader. She understood that Julian's failure wasn't just a personal one. It was a fundamental error in his administrative philosophy. You cannot build a sustainable future on a foundation of fear and public humiliation. The metrics he worshipped were actually the very things that were blinding him to the truth. Julian stayed stuck in his old comfortable patterns, blaming the changing market and the lazy younger generation for his struggles. He went on tech podcasts to complain about the death of ambition and the loss of the hustle culture he loved. He didn't realize that the world had moved past his narrow, cold vision of what success looked like. He was like a captain, demanding his crew row harder, while the ship was already sinking beneath their feet. But the real secret is, the most dangerous place to be is in a room where nobody is allowed to tell you the truth. Maya's own project was thriving precisely because it was built on the opposite of Julian's toxic principles. She was seeing the real-world impact of her human-centric algorithms in the families her software was actually helping. Her data showed that empathy wasn't just a moral choice. It was a more accurate way to predict complex human outcomes. She was proving that you could be both compassionate and incredibly successful in the most competitive industry on Earth. The distance between her scratched library table and Julian's corner office was shrinking every single day. Reports started circulating that a major AI conglomerate was looking to acquire Julian's failing company for its patents. The buzz in the Silicon Valley coffee shops was all about who would lead the audit and determine the final price. Julian was desperate for a bailout, a way to save his reputation and his massive ego-driven ego. He thought he was preparing for a standard corporate merger with a few boring suit-wearing accountants. He had no idea that the past was coming back to collect a very specific kind of debt. Maya closed her laptop, her decision finally made and her strategy perfectly in place. The 14 months of quiet preparation were over, and the era of the glitch was about to begin. The conference room at Orion AI was a far cry from the dusty library corner in San Jose. Maya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling corporate campuses of Mountain View. The air was pressurized and perfectly filtered, smelling faintly of expensive ozone and ambition. Behind her, the board members of the largest AI conglomerate in the world were discussing their next strategic acquisition. They needed the natural language patents held by a struggling firm called Zenith Systems, Julian's company. The CEO of Orion, a woman who moved with the precision of a master clock, tapped a digital file. "We need someone who understands Zenith's core architecture better than they do," she said quite firmly. "Someone who can see through the inflated metrics and find the real value hidden in their messy legacy code." She looked directly at Maya, the lead auditor, who had spent the last 8 months rewriting the foundation of ethical AI. "Do you feel prepared to lead the due diligence team for this specific and critical purchase?" Maya didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat, her spine straight and her expression perfectly unreadable. She knew every line of that code because she was the one who had actually written the most successful parts of it. She understood the flaws that Julian had tried to hide under layers of marketing jargon and fake growth projections. But wait, there's more to this appointment than just technical skill. The board saw her as a brilliant auditor, but Maya saw herself as a debt collector arriving to settle an old account. She began assembling her team of specialists, choosing people who valued accuracy over corporate ego. They would be entering Zenith's headquarters tomorrow morning under a strict non-disclosure agreement. Julian was desperate for the cash infusion, so he had agreed to a full, unfiltered audit of his entire organization. He expected a team of grey-suited accountants who would be easily impressed by his charismatic presentation. He had no idea that the person leading the investigation was someone he had once called a persistent glitch. Maya reviewed the final briefing documents as the sun set over the Pacific. Her armor was finally ready, and her mission was clearly and undeniably defined. She wasn't going back for a simple apology or a cheap moment of public embarrassment. She was going back to determine the actual worth of a man who thought he could define her value. The elevator doors closed with a soft, expensive chime as she prepared to return to the place where it all began. Would Julian even recognize the visionary he had tried to delete from his reality? The lobby of Zenith Systems headquarters felt colder than the January morning Maya had left it 14 months ago. She walked through the heavy glass doors, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, steady authority on the polished marble floor. The air was stale, smelling of stress, vanilla-scented air freshener, and the frantic energy of a company trying to hide its own decline. She led her team of 4 specialists toward the main conference room, the very same one where her career had once been publicly executed. Why does a place that held so much pain always seem so much smaller when you return with the power to change its future? Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the same seat he had used to rule his kingdom with an iron stopwatch. But the man in that chair wasn't the invincible, sharp-edged ruler Maya remembered from that brutal day. His hair was noticeably thinner at the temples. His expensive tie was slightly crooked, and his eyes were glued to a spreadsheet that clearly didn't have the answers he needed. He looked like a captain waiting for a storm to sink his boat, his skin pale under the harsh LED lights. He was tapping a silver pen against the table, a nervous tick that betrayed his supposed corporate composure to everyone in the room. The heavy door opened, and Maya stepped into the space, with her team trailing behind her like a professional security detail. Julian looked up, his face instantly shifting into a practiced salesman-like grin that didn't quite reach his anxious, wandering eyes. He saw a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal Armani suit, her dark hair pulled back into a sharp professional bun that showed no weakness. He saw the high-level representative of the massive AI conglomerate that currently held his entire future in their hands. But here is where it gets interesting, because he didn't recognize the persistent glitch he had deleted over a year ago. Maya sat directly across from him, placing her slim leather folio on the table, with a quiet, deliberate thud that echoed in the silence. Julian began his usual routine, talking about Zenith's unparalleled market potential and their aggressive roadmap for global AI dominance. He spoke as if the mass resignations and the plummeting stock price were just minor technical hurdles in a grander, more successful plan. He was still trying to sell a beautiful dream to a group of people who were only there to perform an autopsy on his reality. Does he really believe his own lies, or is he just terrified of the quiet that comes after they fail? Maya stayed perfectly silent as her team began unpacking their tablets and connecting to the secure internal Zenith servers. She watched Julian's hands as he talked, noticing the slight, unmistakable tremor in his fingers as he pointed at the false growth projections. She was no longer the panicked, exhausted mother trying to quiet a crying baby over a loud and public Zoom call. She was the one holding the stopwatch now, and every second was making Julian look more like a relic of a dying era. She opened her folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, her movements slow and perfectly controlled. Julian leaned forward, trying to read the name on her folder, but Maya kept it angled, just out of his frantic, desperate reach. He thought he was dealing with a complete stranger, a cold professional sent from Mountain View to decide if his life's work was worth saving, because the silence in that room was becoming a physical weight that Julian's ego couldn't handle for much longer. He laughed, nervously, trying to break the tension with a tired joke about the intensity of the modern tech market. Maya didn't smile. She just looked at him with an expression that was as sharp as a surgical blade. She finally looked him directly in the eye, and for a split second, Julian's salesman grin faltered into a confused, lingering frown. He felt a flicker of something familiar in her steady gaze, a distant memory of a face he had tried to erase from his mind. But he quickly dismissed the thought, because surely that system error could never end up in a room of this caliber. He sat back, trying to reclaim some of his lost authority, and asked the lead auditor where exactly they should begin their deep dive. Maya opened her mouth to speak, and the sound of her voice made the silver pen fall from Julian's hand. Julian picked up the silver pen from the floor, a slight flush of irritation crossing his face as he tried to laugh off the awkward moment with a dry, hollow chuckle. He leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, a thin, oily layer of confidence finally returning to his pale and anxious face. He adjusted his silk tie with a flourish and spread his hands across the table as if he were still welcoming guests to a lavish dinner party at his Palo Alto home. He spoke with a smooth, practiced baritone that had fooled hundreds of hungry investors during the last fiscal year. "We are absolutely thrilled to have Orion AI in the room today," he began, his eyes scanning the silent faces of the auditors with a desperate hidden hunger for approval. He was performing a version of success that no longer existed, a ghost story told in a dying corporate language. Why do men like him always believe their own voice is the only cure for a broken and bleeding balance sheet? He looked directly at Maya, though her official nameplate was still turned slightly away from his curious and wandering gaze. He didn't see the woman he had crushed 14 months ago. He only saw a hurdle he needed to charm his way over with a few well-timed smiles and empty promises. "I must say, I am quite surprised to see such an intensive team sent for a routine patent audit," Julian remarked, his smile sharpening into something condescending and sharp. He leaned closer toward her, lowering his voice as if sharing a corporate secret among elite friends in a private Silicon Valley club. "It must be quite a heavy burden for you leading a professional team like this, while managing a complicated and demanding home life." He let the sentence hang in the cold air, a verbal trap designed to remind her of her supposed place. He didn't wait for her to respond, his massive ego already moving toward the next stage of his rehearsed and empty presentation. "We value the female perspective here at Zenith, even if it sometimes struggles with the high-stakes rapid pace of real technological innovation," he added, with a dismissive and arrogant wave of his hand. He laughed, a short sound that echoed uncomfortably against the sterile glass walls of the conference room. "I've seen many talented women let their professional focus drift toward nursery rhymes and pediatrician appointments when the pressure of a global software sprint becomes too much. Was he really trying to win her over, or was he just incapable of seeing a woman as an equal in a modern boardroom? But wait, there is more to his practiced arrogance than just his words. He pulled out a leather-bound internal report and slid it across the mahogany surface with a dramatic flourish. Our internal metrics are perfectly sound, despite the recent noise coming from the disgruntled lower levels of the engineering floor. He claimed, his voice full of a manufactured and very dangerous certainty. He looked at Maya's team, completely ignoring the cold, clinical way they were already tearing through his server architecture on their private tablets. I hope the audit won't be too exhausting for you. We can certainly slow down the technical pace if you find the depth a bit too overwhelming for a morning session. He turned his narrow attention back to Maya, his eyes narrowed as he tried to find a single crack in her stone-cold professional armor. You have a very serious and familiar quality about you, miss. Lead auditor, he said, the silence stretching as he realized he still didn't have her full name in front of him. It reminds me of a former employee we had to let go last year. She had that same stubborn, unrefined energy that didn't quite fit our elite corporate standards. He shook his head with a fake theatrical sigh that lacked any real warmth. She thought being a mother was a full-time job that entitled her to special treatment in a billion-dollar firm. Do people like Julian ever realize that their cruelty is actually their greatest technical failure? He began to describe the visionary leadership he had provided during the last crisis, using a series of buzzwords that had lost their meaning months ago. He spoke of hyper-growth and synergistic alignment while the room watched his actual data bleeding out in real time on the digital monitors. He was a man drowning in his own propaganda, still convinced that he was the only hero of the Silicon Valley story. He even leaned back and checked his gold watch, as if Maya's team was wasting his valuable time. I have a high-level board meeting at noon, so let's try to keep the questions simple and avoid getting bogged down in the sentimental details. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, his eyes still wandering toward the door as if he expected a standing ovation to arrive. He was so confident in his own superiority that he hadn't noticed the way Maya's team was perfectly and silently synchronized in their work. They weren't looking at his colorful slides. They were looking at the evidence of his professional negligence. Now listen carefully to this part, because Julian was about to learn exactly what happens when that messy human emotion returns with a master's degree in cold, hard justice. Julian walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot, with his hands behind his back, completely unaware that his kingdom was already gone. Success requires a specific kind of purity, a total detachment from the messiness of human emotion, he preached to the silent room. Julian finished his sentence about purity and took an arrogant sip of his coffee. He was waiting for Maya to nod and agree with his cold corporate philosophy. Instead, she leaned forward and placed her hands flat on the mahogany table. The room was suddenly so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Maya looked Julian directly in the eyes, her gaze as sharp as a diamond. "Tell me, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous steady level, "do you still believe that a mother is just a persistent glitch in your operating system?" Julian froze with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth, his eyes widening in total confusion. He searched for the face he had tried to erase 14 months ago. The expensive suit and professional bun had blinded him to the truth for the last hour. But that voice was unmistakable, a sound from a day he thought was buried. 14 months ago, you stood right here and humiliated me in front of 200 people, she continued. You told me that my life was a system error that needed to be deleted. The silver pen Julian had been holding finally slipped from his numb fingers and hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. "Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking and losing its practiced authority. The board members from Orion AI exchanged a quick knowing look, but remained silent. They had already seen the evidence, and now they were watching the final execution. But here is where the information takes a sharp and final turn. Maya didn't just come back to remind him of his cruelty. She came back to deliver the verdict. She pulled a blue-bound folder from her folio and slid it across the table. "I wasn't just auditing your code, Julian," she said, her expression colder than the glass walls. "I was auditing your character and the toxic culture you built on a foundation of fear. Zenith Systems is being acquired today because your best engineers left, and your stock is worthless," she announced. "The patents are the only thing left of value, and I wrote the most important ones before you fired me." She paused, letting the weight sink into his collapsing ego. "The board has reviewed my findings on your pattern of ethical violations and administrative negligence." Maya stood up, her posture straighter than any machine Julian had ever built. "The acquisition goes through at noon, but your contract is terminated. As of this second," she said, with a finality that echoed. "You wanted a system without glitches, Julian. Well, the system just cleared you out." Julian looked down at the folder, his kingdom gone and his pride shattered as the woman he dismissed walked out as the architect of his end. Julian's face was a map of total unfiltered shock. The silence in the conference room was no longer professional. It was clinical. The board members of Orion AI sat like statues, their eyes fixed on the man who had just lost everything in a single quiet sentence. He looked at his desk, his mahogany empire, and finally back at Maya. Was he waiting for her to laugh, or for the world to simply stop spinning? But here is where the situation becomes truly unforgettable. Maya didn't walk away immediately after delivering the final blow. She didn't savor the moment with a petty smile or a rehearsed speech about revenge. Instead, she reached into her slim leather folio and pulled out a small rectangular slip of paper. It wasn't a court summons or a legal notice. It was a personal check from the Maya Sterling Foundation for Social Tech. Julian stared at the check as if it were a strange prehistoric artifact. He didn't understand why the woman who just destroyed his career was offering him money. "What is this, Maya?" he managed to choke out, his voice a pathetic ghost of its former self. "Is this some kind of sick public joke to you?" His hands were shaking so hard that he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. Maya leaned in, her voice calm and remarkably gentle for the words she was about to say. "Do you remember Sarah from the engineering floor?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his pale face. "The girl who sat 3 rows behind me during that all-hands meeting 14 months ago." Julian shook his head slowly, his mind a chaotic blur of faces he had never bothered to learn. Why would he remember a junior developer when he was too busy worshipping his own reflection? Maya continued, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the morning weather. "Sarah filmed you that day, Julian. She filmed every second of your speech about glitches and system errors, while my daughter was crying in the next room." The room seemed to get even colder as the memory of that cruelty flooded back. "She posted that video to LinkedIn and Twitter before I had even finished packing my cardboard box." Now listen carefully to this part, because that video changed the digital world faster than any algorithm Julian had ever designed. It didn't just go viral in the tech community. It became a global symbol of everything wrong with modern corporate culture. Tens of millions of people saw your face, Julian. They saw your stopwatch and your silk tie, and they saw exactly how much you hated the humanity of your own employees. Investors pulled out, talent fled, and the Zenith brand became toxic overnight. But while the world was busy tearing Julian down, they were also building Maya up. Thousands of messages of support flooded her inbox from people who had experienced the same cold, calculated dismissals. Venture capitalists, who actually valued character, reached out to her with open checkbooks. They didn't see a system error. They saw a leader who had endured the fire and come out stronger on the other side. That viral video was the accidental pitch deck for the foundation that eventually bought his company. Maya slid the check across the table until it rested directly in front of Julian's numb, frozen fingers. That video earned my foundation millions in support and exposure, she explained, her gaze as steady as a surgeon's. It allowed me to hire every single engineer you drove away with your 80-hour work weeks. She paused, letting the irony sink into his shattered ego. I consider this your acting fee, Julian. You played the villain so perfectly that you funded my entire future. Julian looked down at the amount on the check, his eyes stinging with a shame he had never felt before. He had spent his whole life trying to be the smartest person in the room, only to realize he had been a tool for someone else's success. He realized that Maya wasn't there to hurt him. She was there to show him that he was finally and completely irrelevant to the story. How does it feel to be the person who accidentally built the throne for the woman you tried to destroy? Maya stood up and adjusted her suit jacket, her movements precise and full of a new, authentic grace. Thank you for the push, Julian, she said, her voice echoing in the sterile room one last time. I never would have found the library if you hadn't shown me the door. She didn't wait for a response, and she didn't look back at the man who was now just a ghost in a glass building. Maya walked out of the conference room, leaving the check behind as the final payment for a debt she no longer carried. Maya turned away from the door Julian had just used for his final exit, her eyes scanning the room where 200 people were still holding their breath. She didn't walk toward the oversized mahogany desk or the leather throne Julian had occupied for so many years. Instead, she stood right in the center of the room, on the same level as the engineers and developers who had spent months terrified of making a single mistake. The cold mechanical hum of the server room was still there, but the suffocating pressure Julian had used to rule his kingdom was starting to evaporate. Why do we build these massive glass monuments to success if they only end up feeling like transparent prisons for the people inside? She looked at the faces of the senior developers, men and women, who hadn't seen their families for dinner in weeks because of Julian's mandatory sprints. She saw the exhaustion in their eyes and the slight tremor in their hands as they waited for a new commander to start barking orders about peak efficiency. I know exactly what you are thinking, Maya said, her voice warm and remarkably steady in the absolute stillness. You are wondering if the new management is just a more expensive version of the old cruelty. She paused, allowing the honesty of the moment to settle into the collective consciousness of the room. Maya began to talk about the philosophy she had spent 14 months perfecting in that quiet library corner in San Jose. She spoke about the difference between a high-performance machine and a thriving community of actual human beings. Julian had viewed every single one of them as a biological data point that needed to be optimized or deleted from the payroll. He thought that empathy was a technical debt that slowed down the march toward global market dominance. But a company that values its stock price more than its souls will always find itself bankrupt of innovation in the end. But wait, here is where it gets interesting. Because Maya didn't just give a speech about feelings. She brought a new operating system for the entire company. She announced that Zenith Systems would be the first to implement the Guardian Protocol as its core organizational structure. She told the room that the era of 80-hour work weeks and public humiliation was officially and permanently over. Effective immediately, every single employee would have access to flexible remote work and a mandatory 4-day work week. Success is not measured by the number of hours you spend sitting at a desk under LED lights. It is measured by the quality of the life you lead when you leave this building. She looked directly at Sarah, the developer who had filmed the video that changed everything, and gave her a small knowing nod of gratitude. We are launching an in-house childcare center on the first floor starting next month. Maya continued, her voice rising with a new kind of authority. No parent in this company will ever have to hide a baby monitor under their desk or apologize for a crying child again. The silence in the room was finally broken not by a baby's cry, but by the sound of 200 people exhaling at the exact same time. It was the sound of a toxic culture finally being flushed out of the system, because Maya's message wasn't just about kindness. It was a masterclass in modern business logic. She explained that by treating people with dignity, They were actually creating a more resilient and powerful organization for the long term. Compassion wasn't a glitch. It was the ultimate insurance policy against the burnout and turnover that had almost destroyed Zenith. She wasn't just the architect of a new algorithm. She was the architect of a new way to exist in Silicon Valley. Maya stood before them as a mother, an engineer, and a leader who knew that the most valuable code in the world is the one that connects us to each other. Maya walked away from the bright lights and the lingering applause of the main engineering floor. She needed a moment of absolute quiet to let the reality of the day finally sink in. She found Sarah sitting in the back of the small, dimly lit employee break room near the servers. Sarah was the same junior developer who had been completely invisible to Julian for 3 long years. She was holding a cold cup of tea, staring out at the parking lot with a heavy expression. Maya sat down across from her, the expensive Armani fabric of her suit rustling in the stillness. "I never got the chance to say thank you properly, Maya," began her voice, soft and very genuine. Sarah looked up, her face, a mixture of lingering fear and a sudden overwhelming sense of relief. She had spent 14 months wondering if she had ruined Maya's life by posting that specific video. She didn't know if the exposure had helped or if it had just made the pain public. "I just couldn't sit there and watch him do that to you," Sarah whispered, her eyes filling. "Why do we stay silent when we see someone being treated like they don't actually matter?" Sarah explained how her hands had been shaking while she held her phone under the desk that morning. She was terrified of being caught by Julian's security team or losing her own health insurance. But the sound of Lily crying had triggered something deeper than her fear of a corporate boss. She saw a mother fighting for her child and a man trying to extinguish that beautiful light. Sarah had uploaded the file to a burner account, hoping someone, somewhere, would see the truth. She didn't expect a revolution. She just wanted a single person to care. But the real secret is Sarah had almost deleted the video 3 times before she finally hit the post button. She was worried that the world would side with Julian's cold logic about productivity and efficiency metrics. She feared that people would see Maya as the problem instead of the victim of a toxic culture. "I thought I was just throwing a stone into a very dark ocean," Sarah admitted, quite sadly. "I didn't think the ripples would actually bring you back here today in that suit." It was the confession of a woman who didn't know her own power. Maya reached across the small table and placed her hand over Sarah's cold, trembling fingers. "That video didn't just expose Julian," Maya said, her gaze steady and full of a new healing warmth. "It showed me that I wasn't alone in that room, even when it felt like I was." She explained how the global support had given her the courage to visit that library every morning. Sarah's small act of defiance had been the foundation for the Maya Sterling Foundation and the protocol. Could a 30-second clip really be the bridge between a tragedy and a brand new beginning? They sat in the quiet break room for a long time, the weight of the past 14 months finally lifting. Maya realized that she had been carrying a version of Sarah in her mind during every late-night coding session. She wasn't just working for Lily anymore. She was working for every invisible person who had ever taken a risk. "You're not a junior developer anymore," Sarah Maya said with a firm, professional smile. "I need people with your kind of courage to lead the new ethical AI division." The past was finally forgiven, and a new partnership was born in a quiet kitchenette. The sun was starting to set over the Santa Cruz Mountains as Maya pulled her car into the driveway of her new home. This wasn't the dark corner of San Jose with the flickering streetlights and the constant hum of the intersection. This was a quiet, tree-lined street where the air smelled like jasmine and fresh-cut grass instead of exhaust fumes and desperation. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on a clean driveway that she actually owned. She adjusted her charcoal suit one last time, but the armor felt different now that the war was finally over. Why does the world look so much brighter when you are no longer fighting just to exist? She opened the front door and was immediately met by the frantic, joyful pitter-patter of tiny feet on the polished hardwood floor. Lily, now 14 months older and vastly more confident, came charging toward her with a gap-toothed grin that outshone any boardroom light. Maya dropped her leather folio on the hallway bench and scooped her daughter up, burying her face in the toddler's soft, sun-warmed hair. The Armani fabric was expensive and sharp, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the tactile weight of a child who was safe and healthy. This was the only metric that truly mattered to her in the end. Maya walked into the kitchen, a space that was large, bright, and filled with the promise of a long, peaceful dinner. She glanced at her phone sitting on the marble counter, but she didn't check her banking app, with a knot of cold fear in her stomach. The insurance was active, the bills were automated, and the Lily's future jar was no longer a desperate, empty hope. It was a living reality. She remembered the nights when $1.200 was her entire world. A thin line between a home and the street. How many other mothers were currently staring at a blue screen and praying for a miracle they didn't think would come? But here is where the true profit of the journey revealed itself. Maya looked at the bookshelf in the living room, where a few borrowed library books on advanced AI still sat. They were small reminders of the scratched wooden table and the dusty reference section where her transformation began. Arthur's mentorship hadn't just given her a high-level career. It had given her back her dignity and her authentic voice. She wasn't just a survivor of Julian's toxic culture. She was the person who had rebuilt it into something human. Knowledge was the primary weapon, but love was the only reason she had learned to use it so effectively. She thought about the personal check she had left on the mahogany table for Julian earlier that afternoon. It was a final, graceful closing of a chapter that had almost broken her spirit 14 months ago. By paying him an acting fee, she had stripped him of his power to ever be a villain in her life again. He was no longer a monster to be feared, just a man who had accidentally funded a revolution through his own short-sightedness. Why do we give so much power to people who cannot even see the value of a single human life? Maya carried Lily to the large window that looked out over the neighborhood park in the golden hour. She watched the other parents pushing strollers and kids playing on the grass as the evening light turned the valley to gold. For the first time in over a year, she didn't feel like a glitch in a cold, unfeeling corporate system. She felt like the architect of a new world, where being a mother was a strength instead of a professional liability. Her 14-month exile was the most expensive education she had ever received, but the graduation ceremony was happening right now in this quiet room. She sat on the sofa, still holding Lily close, and let the quiet of the house wrap around them like a warm blanket. The corporate battles and the intense late-night coding sessions were finally behind her, replaced by the soft breathing of a happy child. She had returned to the place she left, but she had come back as someone the old Maya wouldn't have even recognized. The system error had built a masterpiece, and the primary investor was currently falling asleep in her arms. This wasn't just a victory over a boss. It was a victory for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Maya Sterling's journey wasn't just about a corporate acquisition or a fancy Armani suit. It was about reclaiming a soul that a cold and unfeeling world had tried to measure with a stopwatch. Julian saw a mother as a broken piece of equipment that was slowing down his high-speed machine. He never realized that the very thing he called a glitch was actually Maya's greatest source of power. How many people are currently sitting in sterile offices feeling like they are just a line of code waiting to be deleted? In the fast-paced landscape of Silicon Valley, we are often taught that our value is tied directly to our business cards. We are told that being efficient is far more important than being human in the pursuit of dominance. But Maya proved that true innovation requires more than just high-speed processors and complex neural networks. It requires a heart that actually understands the daily struggle of the people who will eventually use the software. If you build your empire on empathy, you aren't just creating a product. You are building a community that lasts. Some might call Maya's return to Zenith Systems a form of perfect and calculated revenge. But if you look closely at the check she left behind, you see something much more graceful than anger. Julian's own culture of fear and exhaustion was the thing that pulled the trigger on his career. Maya simply stepped into the vacuum he created with her own brand of quiet and steady competence. She showed the world that kindness isn't a professional weakness in a competitive market. In fact, it is the most sustainable and powerful business strategy we have ever seen. Those 14 long months in the public library weren't just a time for learning advanced Python or AI architecture. They were a necessary period of healing and internal reconstruction for a woman who had been publicly dismantled. Maya turned her humiliation into a private masterclass in resilience and the power of grit. She realized that knowledge is the only weapon that a cruel boss can never take away from your hands. When you have the truth and the tools, you no longer have to beg for a seat at the table. If you are listening to this right now and you feel like a system error in someone else's narrow vision, please listen. Your personal circumstances do not define your professional ceiling, no matter what a Julian might tell you. Your role as a parent or a caregiver is not a liability to your career. It is your unique data point that allows you to see the human solutions that others are too blind to find. Don't let a person with a silver pen decide what you are truly worth today. True success isn't found in a mahogany office or a high-level title at a global conglomerate. Maya found her true profit in the joyful pitter-patter of tiny feet on a polished hardwood floor. She returned to the place she left, but she came back as a person the old Maya wouldn't have recognized. The system error built a masterpiece, and the primary investor was a happy child falling asleep in her arms. This wasn't just a victory over a boss. It was a victory for every person told they didn't belong.